Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another edition of IRENA Insights webinar series. My name is Karan Kocher, and I'm joining from IRENA's Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn, Germany. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I would like to introduce IRENA and our webinar series. IRENA is an intergovernmental organization with 169 member countries and another 15 countries in their accession process. We support countries in the transition to a sustainable energy future and serve as the principal platform for international cooperation, a center of excellence, and a repository of policy, technology, resource, and financial knowledge on renewable energy. And because our analytical work and our engagement with our members generates a lot of valuable insights, we're constantly looking for more ways to share those insights with you. We have organized close to 60 webinars on various topics, and you can check them all on our IRENA events website. The link to that will be in the presentation slides. We understand that there are many longer deep dive webinars out there, but our aim is to keep these webinars short and sweet, lasting approximately 30 minutes. While we cannot cover everything in this time frame, we hope to give you enough information, and more than that, the sources of more in-depth information to help you explore further. Next slide, please. Today, in the next 30 minutes, we will hear from several experts from IRENA who will share key insights from our recent report, the energy transition in Africa, opportunities for international cooperation with a focus on the G7. But before I hand the microphone to them, a few housekeeping items. Next slide, please. The webinar will be recorded and posted on the IRENA events website. The slides and the recordings will also, like I said, the slides will be, and the slides and the recording will be uploaded on the IRENA events website. You're by default on mute, and we encourage you to use the Q&A function to ask any questions. And without any further ado, let me welcome our panelists to the IRENA Insights webinar series. Asami, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Karan. Next slide, please. So I would like to present so welcome everyone, and I'm gonna just start with setting the context, and this presentation will be shared with 3 other colleagues, Tiara from the KPFC, the Knowledge Finance and Policy Center, Isaac from IITC, and Nurwazi from IITC as well. I will be speaking first about the context, and then the other colleagues will be speaking about the 4 areas for collaboration to accelerate partnership for renewables between the G7 and Africa. And this section will discuss the critical enablers for infrastructure investments and also to cover recommendation for the G7 Africa partnership discussed in the report. Next slide, please. Thank you. This report was prepared at the request of the Italian G7 presidency to help to frame the G7 Africa partnership and its priority areas. And in doing so, we reflected the following overarching goals emerged from the discussion at the G7 meetings. The first one is to ensure any actions are in harmony with the regional goals. And these goals are outlined in Agenda 2063, the African Union's climate strategy, and the Nairobi Declaration on Climate Change and Call to Action, among many others. And it is also to build on existing initiatives and to acknowledge and to learn from the work that has already been done to drive the energy transition in Africa. And that will be the key to avoid the duplication. Thirdly, we wanted to highlight the importance of finance, and the flow of the public money into the African energy sector was particularly the focus where Diala will be speaking about. And then finally, to ensure local ownership and value creation so that the actions must support countries to develop their own value chains. Next slide, please. So IRENA work has been supporting and we are building on the strong partnership with African countries through nearly universal membership of African countries in the IRENA, which is about 46 countries, which is 46 countries. And this report was built on the IRENA's existing programs on Africa, and in particular, those that are highlighted in blue are the main inputs to this report. And they include accelerated partnerships for renewables in Africa, in short, APLA, as a platform for strategic critical engagement with African renewable champions. And then the Energy Transition Financing, ETAF platform to support financing for climate action, renewable market, and then thirdly, the renewable market analysis to provide analytical contribution for accelerated energy transition. Then finally, Continental Power Sector Master Plan, where IRENA participated as a modeling partner to provide in-depth institutional capacity building. Next slide, please. Building on this, we highlighted first the opportunities and challenges for energy transition in Africa. So Africa is a continent with a great opportunities. The population in many African nations are among the youngest globally, and Africa is endowed with abundant renewable energy resources and also strategic mineral resources that are the key to the energy transition. The green industrialization and overall economic development as a part of the energy transition in Africa also has the opportunity to create millions of jobs on the continent. Finally, African leaders have committed already to the energy transition to make best of these opportunities. But there are also unique challenges to Africa. As many of us know, Africa has an energy deficit of 170 million people who still lack access to electricity in 2021. And they are lagging behind in its goal to achieve universal electricity access by year 2030. And less than 2% of global investment in renewable energy over the last 2 decades went into Africa. Next slide, please. Can you go one step ahead? Yes, thank you. So there's a clear gap in the progress of the overall development or deployment of renewable energy capacity in Africa compared to the G7 and G20 countries. Africa, 2.5 gigawatt of renewable energy power additions in 2023 is substantially lower compared to 413 gigawatt in G20 countries and 69 gigawatt in G7 countries. Africa represents just 1.6% of the global share, indicates considerable scope for growth to unlock its renewable energy potential and also opportunity for investment in the continent. There is also an observation that for the last 20 years, renewable energy investment in globally 2,841 US dollar billion went to Africa, whereas Africa received 60 US dollar billion. And for just an inclusive energy transition, investment needs to be more equitably distributed. Can we go back? Now, on the Africa Power System Status Outlook, this is the major result that comes from the Continental Power System Master Plan that I spoke about, that was led by the African Union, and IRENA supported developing this outlook. And this outlook constitutes the Africans' blueprint for the investment into the energy sector on the way forward. Firstly, current generation capacity is 260 gigawatts for the whole continent, and that constitutes about 4 to 5% of the global power capacity. And it's the typical lifespans of the power assets and expected planning pipelines are realized. Large share of fossil capacity may still exist in 2030 and even by 2040. And this scenario, this is one of the main CMP scenarios where strong demand grows and the strong interconnector will be in place. It is assessed that from about 60 gigawatts of renewable today to jump to nearly 750 gigawatts in 2040. And the main renewable sources will depend on the context, depending on the countries, with the largest share of deployment going to solar PV, wind, and hydropower, and together over 90% of renewable energy capacity by 2040. Together over 60% of renewable capacity by 2040. And this represents at least $1 trillion of investment from now until 2040 for renewable capacity storage and cross-border interconnection, and likely more for local transmission and distribution improvement. And the pace of growth will differ really across the countries. And CMP modeling was done for each and every African countries. And CMP identified the country champions for the renewable energy technology deployment. So with that, I hand over now to Diara. Thank you.
Thank you, Asami. As Asami mentioned before, I will be focusing more on the investments that go into renewable energy in Africa and how we can increase them. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so as mentioned by Asami, Africa received only 2% of the global renewable energy investment between 2000 and 2020. In 2021, it was a worse even year because of COVID and other geopolitical and other developments. So 2021, Africa received only 1% of global investments. 22, 23, the investments picked up, but Africa still receives a very small percentage of the global. And if we look at 2023, we see that a large part of these investments, for example, were in one project of geothermal in Kenya. So one project can tilt the investments, the annual investments in one way or another, which is not an indication of a sector that receives continuous and sustainable investments. And if we look at this, the investments per capita, this is when the disparities in investments between sub-Saharan Africa and the rest of the world become very evident. We see that sub-Saharan Africa received just $13 per capita in energy transition-related investments during the period 2020 to 2023, whereas advanced economies received 176 times more that number. So we see the growing disparities in investments on a per capita basis between advanced economies and Africa, although Africa is in need of energy. It's not that Africa's economies are not that big. There is a huge deficit, and we need a lot of investments to fill that deficit, and as Asami mentioned, fuel socioeconomic development and growth. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, looking at investments that do go into Africa, although we said they are a very small percentage of the global, what's more is that these investments are focused in a few countries. So we see there are 4 countries, Egypt, Kenya, Morocco, and South Africa, that received around 75% of the investments of African investments between 2020 between 2000 and 2020. And then if we further look into the distribution of these investments, we see that 10% of these investments went to countries that received less than 0.5% per country, and then the remaining 15% went to countries that received a bit more than or a bit less than 2% of the African investments. So one of the issues we see is that the weighted average cost of capital in Africa is much higher than the rest of the world, which is very paradoxical because this means that the lower income populations are paying the most for energy. If we look at the weighted average cost of capital for utility scale solar PV projects in Africa, we see that they ranged between 6.9% and 10.7% between 2019 and 2021, compared to 2.2% to 10% in Western Europe. And when we look at those projects, it's important to know that these projects are the projects that actually did materialize and get developed. So it means that these are the projects that were in countries with an appropriate regulatory framework that did receive support from multilateral development banks in one way or another. So if we look at other projects that did not receive this support, or in other countries that do not have this stable environment, we are looking at a much higher cost of capital. So only 10% of infrastructure projects in Africa actually make it from pipeline stage to financial closure, which means the 90% that is remaining most likely has much higher cost of capital. And especially when we're looking at the least developed countries with the most difficult conditions and the highest risks, this is where the private sector doesn't want to go. And if they want to go, they go at very high costs. So this goes back to what I was saying a minute earlier, that the least developed countries or the lowest income populations would pay the highest for energy. So this means that there is a need for more public support in these contexts. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, if you look at the distribution between private and public investments in Africa, we see that the role of the public sector is much higher than the rest of the world. So public finance in Africa accounts for around 45% of direct investments, compared to 24% globally. So as I said, we need a lot of more public support in countries or contexts that are perceived with higher risk than the others. And also another interesting fact is that if we look at sub-Saharan Africa, only half of the renewable energy investments come from domestic sources. If we look at other places, more than 3/4 of these investments come from domestic places, like for example in Europe or in America, which means that in Africa we have to import financing, and we have to import it at very high cost and pay it back at the level of the currency where it was borrowed in hard currency, which increases the risk of these investments. Which means that a lot of private investors cannot go to Africa, and if they do, they do at a much higher cost than what is affordable in some contexts. So this means that we need a large intervention from public finance. And since a lot of the countries in Africa are already constrained with debt and other macroeconomic constraints, then we are looking at a context where we need a lot of support from the international community. For example, in the form of climate finance or development finance or other type of support. And the G7 can help a lot in this regard. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, in the SDG 7 tracking report that we do every year with the other custodian agencies, we track the international public flow into clean energy in general, including renewable energy. And we track those investments by sources of investments and also by instrument. And we see, first of all, that international public flow into clean energy is in a decline in general. So although it has picked up last year, we still are nowhere near where we need to be. Only $15.4 billion have been committed from developed to developing countries. And again, this is in clean energy in general. For only 44% of the international public financial commitments went to Africa and benefited only 33 LDCs of the continent. So if we look at the way that finance is structured in Africa, we see that around 30% of the finance for independent power producers comes from multilateral and development finance institutions, which show that this flow is very important in Africa. However, we see that this flow is in decline. And in 2020, multilateral and bilateral DFIs provided less than 3% of the total global energy investments. So this means that the international public finance is not enough, and we need much more in the region, especially from the G7. So what can the G7 do? Can we go to the next slide? So there are some areas where the G7 can support. So G7, together with African countries and governments, need to harness Africa's growth potential to foster shared prosperity, environmental sustainability, and economic development, which will be essential. So G7 can increase the public financial flows for Africa's energy transition through multiple channels. We mentioned the multilateral and bilateral DFIs. One of them, there's funds that such as the JETP or the Green Climate Fund. And this money can be channeled through different strategies and policy instruments, or for example, capacity building or support and infrastructure investments. There's a need for a push for reforming the way multilateral development banks support developing economies in general, but specifically in the energy sector. The G7 countries are the main shareholders of multilateral development banks, so they can leverage their influence on global and development finance architecture to lower the cost of capital in Africa. So also the replenishment of the International Development Association offers a big opportunity. And finally, the G7 can support African countries identify and develop projects with transformative impact by facilitating access to existing project development facilities. Examples are the Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa or others. Also, the G7 can establish dedicated facilities within African institutions to support the transition. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, looking at the energy access and productive use of energy in particular, so the whole sector is in the same situation when it comes to investments and requires the same solutions. But if we go and zoom into the energy access space, it's a bit different and requires additional support. So can we go to the next slide, please? So IRENA has developed a framework to show how the international flow of public money can flow into solutions that can support increased energy access in clean cooking and also in electricity. And it shows also the potential instruments that can take those funds, for example, grants and subsidies or risk mitigation or other regulations, and take them to the recipients in order to support manufacturing or end users or civil society to kickstart economic development. So in the access context in particular, public finance has a core role to play in deploying energy services to areas that these services are not usually addressed by the market. For example, there are activities such as energy planning or capacity building to support an environment, to invest in supportive solutions to support productive uses and renewable energy deployment, to ensure the energy access to the last mile and underserved and marginalized communities, to bridge the end user affordability gaps, because we continue to see issues with affordability in some contexts, and of course to de-risk and catalyze private capital. So thank you very much, and I hand over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Diala, and hello, everyone. I will now present some information regarding opportunities for collaboration in the area of critical materials. If we can go to the next slide, please. The full decarbonization of our energy systems will require significant amounts of critical materials, many of which are abundant across the African continent. For instance, lithium, which is widely used for EV batteries and stationary energy storage, is plentiful in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ghana, Mali, Namibia, and Zimbabwe. These countries together account for approximately 5 million tons of lithium resources, which is about 30 times the global production in 2023. The African continent also hosts over 25% of global natural graphite reserves, over 35% of manganese reserves, over 50% of cobalt reserves, and over 75% of phosphate rock reserves, from which phosphorus can be produced. All of these materials are widely used in energy transition technologies, such as EV batteries and stationary energy storage. Next slide, please. The expected surge in material resource demand due to the energy transition presents an opportunity for attracting new investment flows to the African continent. If managed effectively, these new resources revenues could spur long-term economic benefits, green job creation, and sustainable local development. In light of this, in the report we highlight several key areas in which the G7 can collaborate with African nations around this topic. This includes supporting effective regulation and social and environmental safeguards, such as developing and implementing regulatory frameworks that encourage responsible and sustainable mining practices, environmental protection, and adherence with international standards for labor rights and social responsibility. This need is especially urgent in artisanal and small-scale mining, where 8 million miners in 7 African nations alone face poor working conditions, low wages, and inadequate social protection. A second key area is realizing new opportunities in the supply chain. Critical to materializing the benefits associated with these resources, it's not just to increase exports of raw materials, but also to move up the value chain and attract higher margin activities, such as material processing or even battery or EV manufacturing. This is as processed materials are associated with premium prices compared to unrefined ores, reflecting the value added during refinement. The G7 can support African countries to move beyond primary ore exports and embrace these higher value activities. By prioritizing mineral processing, nations can potentially improve their trade balance, lower transportation and infrastructure costs within the sector, and stimulate local economic growth. A third collaboration area is decarbonizing mining operations. Mining and processing activities involve significant electricity and diesel use. Leveraging solar and wind and batteries on site could yield substantial savings and decarbonize these operations. The G7 can support the development of innovative decarbonization projects in African nations by enabling technology transfer initiatives, facilitating finance, and providing technical expertise and capacity building support to create truly sustainable value chains and energy transition technologies. A fourth collaboration area is to actively engage against corruption. Addressing the governance of critical material projects is needed to reduce corruption risks, avoid tax revenue losses from inadequate tax frameworks, and better manage revenue allocation from these projects. These measures are critical to ensure transition mineral projects do not replicate past experiences that harm people and the environment. The G7 should proactively collaborate with African governments, industry stakeholders, business, including their own, and civil society to improve regulatory frameworks aimed at increasing accountability, transparency, and public participation. With this, I conclude my section, and now I will pass the floor to my colleague Nolwasi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isaac. I will now present the area of cooperation in strengthening institutional frameworks and capacity. Next slide, please. In this slide, I would like to emphasize the CMP as one of the central continental initiatives to achieve the goals of the Agenda 2063. The CMP is a visionary blueprint for Africa's energy transition, hence it is presented here as an area of cooperation. The CMP presents a unique platform for consolidating all 5 Africa's power pole and continental bodies. It is a fully Africa-owned plan driven by an Africa-owned process following the mandate of the African heads of states. IRENA, as a modeling partner, is supporting the development of the CMP through a capacity building program using robust methodologies, working with other partners, including the IAEA, the European Commission, GIZ, and AFDB. And this process is led by the African Development Agency, NUPAD. The CMP represents the Africa-led view of major power sector investment needs. And in this figure, I'm showing the main CMP scenario. And the key message here is interconnection infrastructure needs that needs to be massively scaled up from 23 gigawatts to 167 gigawatts by 2040. A key enabler for this growth will be the cross-border transmission. The development of interconnection infrastructure will bring substantial socioeconomic benefits to the continent. Next slide. Energy transition for Africa needs an ecosystem approach. Collaboration in strengthening institutional framework and capacity offers opportunity for inclusive development. Putting in place these structures is needed for this ecosystem. Major areas for this cooperation are presented in these slides. Firstly, strengthening the connection between long-term energy planning and financing of energy infrastructure projects. Linking and aligning energy planning and finance is critical for mobilizing investment for clean energy, and this area needs to be strengthened in Africa. Secondly, investing in institutional capacity, maintaining the CMP efforts and reinforcing the national planning. Through the CMP process, a foundation for institutional capacity has been established. Now this capacity needs to be reinforced. And this brings me to my next 2 points, the promotion of regional integration and technical assistance. The institutional capacity needs to be strengthened to eventually reach the national authorities responsible for energy planning. And this empowerment needs to be done collaboratively with both regional and continental efforts and integrating it with broader energy and economic sectors. Next slide, please. In this next slide, I will quickly highlight the support that is offered by IRENA in the area of energy planning. So IRENA offers support at continental, regional, and national level. And what I would like to emphasize here in these 3 programs is the alignment to the continental processes and also and local ownership. So, and I would also like to highlight that under the Continental Power System Master Plan, what is key is identifying the priority projects for generation and transmission, and also offering technical capacity in project preparation and institutional continental planning. And there's a need to develop the pipeline of commercially attractive projects, and this area needs to be strengthened as well. Next slide. In conclusion, I just want to, on a high level, highlight the few publications that IRENA has offered, which is the first report that you can also access on the website, is the energy transition. And we also have a report on advancement in continental power systems planning for Africa, and also the policies and finance for renewable energy deployment. And lastly, the scenario for energy transition. You can also access these reports in the IRENA website. I will now hand over to Karen for closing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nolwazi. Thank you, Asami, Diala, Isaac, for the presentation. I think we're already running a little over time, so we might not be able to do a full Q&A session, but we have received one question that I can ask to maybe Asami or Nolwazi. You can answer that. But before I go into that, I think there were already a couple of requests for the presentation. As I said initially in the webinar, the recording and the presentation slides will be uploaded in a few days to the IRENA website, to the IRENA events page, and you should be able to access them fairly soon. Okay, the question. So you, Nolwazi, you mentioned that IRENA supports the African Continental Master Plan through these robust modeling exercises. Can you give some examples of how IRENA has supported, perhaps through trainings, how they're conducted, and just a general overview of how this support goes?
Okay, thank you, Karen. To answer this question, IRENA is supported the development of the Continental Power System Master Plan, which is divided into 3 phases. We supported the phase 2, which is the building of capacity. So in that process, we engaged all 5 power poles throughout the NEPAD, and we trained the different African stakeholders in the development of the assumptions, and also in the use of the tools and how results can be extracted. This process took about 2 years to development. So it's a series of training that are conducted in workshops. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Nolwazi. Next slide, please. Okay. So unfortunately, our time is up. We're sorry we ran a little over time, but I would like to thank the speakers for the time and sharing their knowledge and their insights on their latest work. It was very useful personally for me to learn all of this. And I would also like to thank the audience for joining us today, for their attention and for the questions. We hope you learned something new. As I said, the recordings and the slides will be posted on the IRENA events page for those who missed any part of the webinar or would like to revisit it. I would like to wish everyone a good rest of the day, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.